Hey guys, this is your host, Mr. Pessimist, on Government Preamble Podcast number 1. I hope you guys are having a good day. Probably not, though, to be honest. My guest host for today will be Miss Optimist. Miss Optimist, can you say hi?
Hi guys, I'm so excited to be here. I just can't wait to get started. I hope your day's going okay. Hopefully our little talk will make it even better.
Yeah, she's kind of annoying, but we'll make it through this. So the preamble starts with, "We the people, in order to form a more perfect union." In your opinion, Miss Optimist, does the government of the United States do a good job forming a more perfect union?
I mean, it's better than it was. Government is assigned to keep getting better with more and more laws. So yeah, I definitely think things are getting better than they were.
So, though the government is designed to get better with more laws, I believe that government actually complicates things, you know? Our government's in debt, and we have corrupt politicians. The government is still run by people who make mistakes. So I believe that the government's actually taking this country on a downhill.
Well, but if you think about it, I mean, like women can vote now and there's no more slavery and there's like a way higher standard of living. So even if like the little parts of the government aren't working out, overall, I feel like we're in a lot better shape than we were before.
That is a good point, but I disagree with you still. Anyway, let's just move on to number 2 then. In your opinion, does the government do a good job establishing justice in the United States?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I mean, we have a pretty strong Supreme Court that keeps us in check with our principles and morals, so I think that that's a pretty good system.
I'd have to disagree with that. Although the Supreme Court does have the final say of judicial review, sometimes they're not always correct. The Plessy versus Ferguson case about almost a century ago, they stated that segregation was okay, and I don't think that's correct.
Well, but like if you think about it, that was a really long time ago, and that kind of thing just doesn't really happen. And I mean, like, our jails are full, so our judicial system must be working.
Yeah, but you have to think, why are those jails even there? Why are all these people being incarcerated at such a huge rate? Sometimes the best way to solve a problem isn't just to put them in jail. Also, lots of false convictions occur in this country. There's been numerous examples of people in jail for 20 years or even longer, and they're just getting released because of DNA evidence. And also, trials finally take forever to process. The Holmes trial, the Aurora Theater shooting trial, it took about 5 years for the trial to actually emerge from the crime that actually was committed. So all in all, I think they failed at establishing justice.
Well, that is a good point. I guess I just hadn't really thought of it that way.
All right, on to our next question. Has the government done a good job to ensure domestic tranquility? I'm actually going to start off for this one. I would like to say that 12 million total crimes in the U.S. are reported, and that's higher than any other country. So I'm going to say no, domestic tranquility is not existent in America.
Well, I mean, I guess when you put it like that, that seems like a lot, but I feel like Americans tend to report a lot of really minor crimes because we just don't have a lot of like mass scale crimes in the US anymore. So a lot of that is probably just like people stealing candy bars.
Are you implying this actually means that there's more law enforcement and that our country's more safer?
I just feel like compared to other countries, we're a lot safer. I mean, like just the other day, I was reading this FBI crime stats, and it was saying that 63% of violent crimes are aggravated. So, I mean, that's not as bad as just like going around and killing people.
Yes, but what are we going to do about all these mass shootings that are occurring? All right, all this talk about terrorism actually links to our next discussion about providing for the common defense of the United States. So overseas, how are we doing in protecting the American people? I would like to start off by saying terrorism has risen at an extremely alarming rate, and that anywhere a terrorist attack can happen, and that frightens me quite a bit. So I would say that the common defense needs to be a bit stronger. How about you?
I mean, yeah, terrorism is a pretty scary thing, but I feel like in a lot of those cases, there are pretty small occurrences with little deaths when you think of like the big picture. And that kind of thing has happened throughout American history. And I mean, if you really think about it, our biggest casualty in a war was a war on our own soil in the Civil War. So I guess like terrorism overseas and foreign threats seems like a pretty big deal, but when you really think about how many lives are actually being affected by that, I feel like our government is actually doing a pretty good job. Plus, we have soldiers stationed overseas in numerous countries, and on the home front, we've got a pretty good police force. We've got the FBI and the CIA and all sorts of government agencies put in place to protect us.
That is a very good point. I guess that sometimes America needs to get our sense of what defense is and what offense is, and I feel like we're more focusing on offense now, so you have a really good point. So on to our next point. Does the government do a good job promoting the general welfare?
I feel like this is probably the point our government is the most successful in because, anyone can have access to a free education, public schools. Healthcare is also something that the government takes care of for us. Infrastructure, they're in charge of all that. And we have hospitals. So, you can be smart and safe and healthy. And I feel like that's a pretty good deal.
However, there are many homeless people out on the streets right now starving, and the soaring cost of college tuition is really striking, and it's really hard to get into the middle class now because of that. And the shrinking middle class is also just a huge deal right now. Right now, the middle class is no longer the largest class in America right now. And that is a big deal because if you want everyone to be happy and to enjoy a good lifestyle, you can't have such a small middle class.
You bring up a pretty good point. So I guess in a sense, we do still have a lot of work to do in the U.S.
Okay, on the other side, does the government secure the blessings of liberty? This goes kind of against the idea of general welfare because you can't really have liberty and welfare. So what do you think? What are your thoughts on this issue?
I feel like in general, the government does a pretty good job of respecting our liberties. I feel like freedom of speech is pretty well preserved. Again, we have the Supreme Court to keep everyone in check. And speaking of which, our government also has checks and balances to make sure that one branch doesn't get too much power over another. So I feel like that's a pretty good way to ensure everything stays free.
You bring up a pretty good point, but in our efforts to make sure that we're secure, to make sure that we're equal, I feel like they're kind of encroaching on our privacy, This huge controversy over the NSA and tapping into our internet and controlling our speech, it's become a pretty huge deal. Additionally, Obama recently released an executive order that could encroach on our Second Amendment right to bear arms. And I feel like a lot of these liberties are currently under attack. And since more government's becoming just a bigger part of our everyday lives, I feel that some of our liberties are getting compromised as a result. The preamble makes lofty promises to the people of the United States, and it's up to interpretation whether the government of the United States are actually upholding those promises. Thank you for joining me on today's Preamble Podcast, and I'm your host, Mr. Pessimist. And a warm thank you to Miss Optimist for joining me on today's podcast. Miss Optimist, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I had such a great time. I hope I can join you again. I hope everybody's days are just going great. And thank you for listening. I really appreciate it. Bye.
That's all the time we have today. Thank you, and see you next week.